Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. I'm David Wood, a survivor from the early days of the smartphone industry who aspires nowadays to be a radical real-world futurist.
And I'm Callum Chase, a co-founder of the AI safety startup Contium and a writer and keynote speaker on the future of AI.
This is the first of a number of episodes on the broad theme of the technoprogressive opportunity. That's the name of a conference taking place in London on the weekend of 19th and 20th September, co-organised by London Futurists and the IEET, the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. In these episodes, some of the speakers from that conference will be appearing as guests in this show. Our guest today is one of these speakers, Matteo Rossi MacDermant, a technophilosopher from the University of New Mexico. Matteo hosts a show called Bread and Robots, which covers subjects such as post-scarcity economics, universal basic income, the tech workers movement, and how technology can be steered toward collective abundance rather than corporate exploitation. Matteo is also the instructor for an online course called An Introduction to Technoprogressive Worldbuilding. Matteo, welcome to the London Futurists podcast.
Thanks, David. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Matteo.
Thanks, Callum.
Matteo, you describe Bread and Robots as a world-building podcast. What exactly do you mean by world-building?
I primarily look at philosophy and the philosophies that I'm interested in as active philosophies. In some of the ancient philosophies, there was a lot of contemplation. Even now, a lot of philosophers are strictly trying to understand things and contemplate upon them. But my purpose in studying philosophy and politics and culture is for steering philosophy, politics, and culture. In that regard, I want to develop a worldview. I reach out to all kinds of thinkers and activists and people who are working on various projects in order to continuously build out the techno-progressive worldview and to understand the world through that lens, not only to strictly understand it and to describe it, but also to steer it. That's why I also see a direct connection between building a worldview and world building. Anytime we want to understand an issue, everyone is really concerned with AI right now and the dangers of social media to children and the dangers of runaway surveillance into techno dystopian nightmares and this sort of thing. Developing a proper worldview allows us to understand the contours of those things, but we need to go beyond understanding the contours and contribute actively to solving the various problems of our times. That's why I call it a world building podcast and why we also call the course An Introduction to Techno-Progressive Worldbuilding, because in meeting each other and developing these networks, we're both looking to understand things, but also to come together in our networks to contribute something to the future and to build the future together.
Some of our audience may not know exactly what techno-progressivism means. I'm sure everybody's heard of accelerationism, effective altruism, long-termism, and transhumanism. How do you define techno-progressivism?
Techno-progressivism has many similarities with and is part of the histories of several of those ideas, especially transhumanism. But it's a little broader in that it tries to think of technology as a whole. Transhumanism is primarily concerned with the technology that pertains to the human body, to human suffering and freedom, and those embodied forms of technology like biotech and augmentation and that sort of thing. Techno-progressivism is also, of course, concerned with those things. It's concerned with mitigating human suffering and expanding human freedom and the freedom of embodiment, morphological freedom, as it's called, which is the freedom of form, how we exist in the world. But it's also concerned with other things. It's concerned with how do we develop a socially progressive energy system? How do we develop our productive systems? which we can consider as kind of extensions of the human body. Those things were all originally invented by humans, and generations of workers and inventors, scientists, engineers all contributed to the development of those systems, and they all produce things that humans need to survive and things that humans want in order to thrive. But it's really a very expansive view of technology as it applies into all different sectors and to all different ways in which we can interact with reality. When you think about it in terms of politics, there's the politics of the human body and how we interact with the body. But in politics, we're always thinking about how we build cities and how we should build our industrial policy, how we should build our energy policy, how we should build our space policy. And technoprogressivism has a lot to say about all of those things. But in general, I guess in the simplest terms, it's thinking about how we apply justice and freedom to our socio-technical policy, which is to say, the interaction between social and technical policy. A lot of people think of a technology as something that's built just by a company, just by engineers, but it embodies a lot of social values, cultural values. And so whenever we think of technology, we're really thinking of not only how can this be the most efficient in delivering gigawatts in a power plant, but how can it also be socially progressive? In terms of workers, for instance, we might say that a technology would be more techno-progressive if it is safer for workers to work in that power plant, if it produces less pollution, and if it is less disruptive to people's everyday lives, or if it enables greater forms of freedom and justice in society. So it's really an entanglement of social and technical policy, and always thinking of those things together.
You talk about disruption to everyday lives of workers or people generally. You talk about ensuring that the productive system isn't just trying to be as efficient as possible. What do you think about the growth of technological unemployment? That because technology is able to do things more efficiently, often the former laborers, the former workers, actually white collar workers as well as blue collar workers, are increasingly displaced, disrupted. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Do you have clear views on that?
If we do nothing to mitigate and steer these disruptions, then I think it could be very bad. And I think we have been seeing the downsides of not having an active industrial policy. We see this in AI even in the last few years, that without having an active industrial policy to steer its development, which is also itself a problem, it's not that easy to develop an active policy. We have to really be thinking many steps ahead, and we need very competent policy that doesn't cause new problems, which is, of course, unavoidable. We will cause new problems when we try to solve old problems, but we hope that, what's the term? We fail upward. Anything that we create that's a problem is a better problem than the ones that we have today. We can't just do nothing. Doing nothing is also a choice. I'm not sure how much unemployment we will have, but even if we have, say, 10% unemployment from automation, that would be already a huge problem. That was about the unemployment rate in the US and the UK during the Great Recession. It was a huge catastrophe that I don't think we dealt with as well as we could have. And so technoprogressivism has its kind of moral mission, but also efficiency is a good thing. We want to be able to do more with less. We want to be able to increase productivity. If we make a product, we want to get more products with less working hours and less material throughput. All of those things are great. But we also have to understand that if that is running ahead of our ability to adapt to significantly higher productivity, which by itself may or may not be a good thing. We want higher productivity, but we also need to be able to absorb that higher productivity in a way that benefits people. If that productivity gain only goes to a small group of people, like Sam Altman and Elon Musk, it can cause serious social disruption. It can cause political disruption, which can be quite a catastrophe. We are already seeing it with people resisting data centers, people basically thinking that AI is 100% bad and has no upsides whatsoever and are resisting it. Neo-Luddism and anti-tech revolts are increasing. There have been attacks on Sam Altman's house and many other things. This is only with the beginning of disruption. If we see 5, 10x, 100x more disruption, and inequality continues to rise and more trillionaires are created, but unemployment increases, we could see serious consequences. We don't want to wait until after those consequences happen to deal with these problems. We want to say, yes, we want more productivity, but we also want to be able to steer those productivity gains toward, in my view, higher wages for the working class, shorter working hours, more time off to enjoy the fruits of our labor. That's where techno-progressivism, I think, shines, because we're thinking about technological progress and also social progress. And where cultural progress comes in, it enables with more time, with new technologies that enable us to do new things. It allows us to experiment and do things that were not possible before. I believe we have the opportunity to do these things, but it's not that easy. There's a lot of headwinds to it. There's a lot of people inside of AI companies that just really want a laissez-faire approach, and yet they also don't want to have their houses attacked and they don't want to have data centers blocked. There has to be some way around this impasse. And I think that we can offer that.
They're also pretty much the only people of any significance who are actually talking about the enormous changes that are coming and warning, for instance, that we might be heading towards full automation. Have you got any thoughts about what kind of economic system would work well in a world with, let's say, a lot more than 10% unemployment, let's say 50% or more unemployment, which is structural and it's not going away? And so an awful lot of the human population can't get hold of the things that they need for a good life through doing a job because there aren't enough jobs. So have you got some ideas about what kind of economic system would work in that scenario?
We should be thinking about reviving social democracy, but also redesigning it and rebooting it. There are many ways in which redistributive policies could be beneficial here, but also we need a lot of proactive policies. Some policies are both redistributive and proactive. Think of universal basic income. People often refer to it as a redistributive policy, but also it's a proactive policy.
What do you mean by proactive in that sense?
If, for instance, universal basic income is enough that people can meet at least their very basic survival needs, especially if they're in a household with other people. So if there's multiple UBIs in one household, if it's enough to afford rent and food, then your immediate survival is not threatened by unemployment. That increases freedom in such a way that it doesn't just mitigate the harms that come with unemployment, but it also shapes the employment market and it shapes industrial policy quite significantly. Scott Santon's work on UBI has really argued this very strongly, and he's not the only one. He's argued that if people don't absolutely need to work to live, $30,000 a year in their household, that's not very much money. We'd obviously include UBI for the number of children you have as well. Some people suggest half for each child. Children are very expensive to raise. If we have this policy, it changes the way that we would think about employment in general, and it produces a completely different kind of economy. It doesn't just redistribute to lower income people who tend to spend most of their income, and so therefore it massively increases effective demand and spending amongst the lowest income earners. But it also means that people will not work below a certain condition. It means that, for instance, if one person in the family earns money, but then another person wants to go back to school or wants to start a business or do something else, maybe that's not possible, but the UBI makes it possible because they have that cushion. Therefore, a lot more people would be staying home, taking care of kids, or going back to school, starting new businesses, which also has an effect on the economy in a way that is not just redistributive. It also is what Scott calls pre-distributive. It changes the nature of the economy in general. It doesn't just redistribute money. And additionally, it depends on how UBI is itself funded. If it's funded by a sensible tax policy, or if it's funded by another proposal, which is universal basic capital, then it actually changes the tax system in general. Or if it's funded by a land value tax or some combination of those things. For instance, with a land value tax, if the land value tax is used to fund the UBI, it also puts downward pressure on the real estate market. So it lowers the cost of housing as well as increasing the amount of money that goes to the bottom income earners. It puts downward pressure on rent because in the United States, for instance, there's lots of parking lots. Those parking lots pay less taxes than skyscrapers that are next to them, even though they're the same amount of land and have roughly the same value. But LVT, land value tax, many studies have shown allows that tax to be roughly equal between the skyscraper and parking lot. And so land hoarding and developing parking lots, the incentives change. So instead of holding a parking lot, we may build another apartment. The more apartments we build, the cheaper the rent will be, the lower the cost of housing will be. The more dense downtown area is, the more likely people are to ride transit. If the MTA in New York was like the transit system in Seoul or Hong Kong and they owned the land above their tracks, then that puts downward pressure on the cost of transit, which also benefits the same group of people.
I can see positive aspects of a land value tax, but I'm struggling to see that any kind of taxation could raise enough money to fund the kind of basic income scheme that you described. If I got the numbers right, 30,000 per annum, maybe less for children. So maybe an average of 20,000 per annum for 300 plus million people in the USA. So that's, if I've done my sums right, $6 trillion to be funded. Where's $6 trillion going to come from?
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Imagine being in the boardroom with the world's most influential C-suite executives, exploring big questions about the economy, AI, and hybrid work. Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, hosted by Steve Odland, President and CEO of the Conference Board, the ultimate podcast for professionals seeking the truth beyond trending headlines. Cut through the noise and dive into data-driven discussions, unbiased, nonpartisan, and straight from the top. Listen to C-Suite Perspectives and harness the power of trusted insights for what's ahead.
Well, that depends. I was saying it would be roughly 15,000 per individual person. But if you live in a household with two adults, that's 30,000.
Okay.
I, for instance, live in a family of five. So that would be like 22,000 for my kids. So we would have something like 52,000.
So more like 3 trillion than 6 trillion then to fund the kind of basic income scheme.
But Scott has done a really good job showing how this would actually work. First of all, it really depends. I think I would need to have more time to really explain it in full, but there's a lot of redundancy in the existing welfare systems. They're very expensive to maintain. Not to mention the fact that means tested welfare is both worse at providing income to low income people. Even when you use the best practices, it doesn't provide income to everyone who needs it. Only something like 30% of the population that needs it really can take advantage of it effectively. The same thing we see with unemployment insurance. Not everybody could get unemployment insurance. So if, for instance, you get a 1-year contract and then you become unemployed after your contract ends, you're not eligible for unemployment. There's various other cases. And so unemployment only is available for between 25 and 30% of the population at any given time in the US. Again, these are all expensive to maintain because you need a lot of caseworkers to determine if people are looking for work. With welfare, there's this whole very convoluted way of determining if people are, what's the word, deserving, if they're the deserving poor or the undeserving poor. And UBI does away with all of that. It just gives people money. It worries about whether or not they're going to get the full value of that on the back end. If we keep the income tax system, then we would tax UBI at the same rate. And so if you're making zero, then you get 100%. But if you're making $1 million a year, then effectively you don't get any UBI. It would get taxed away in your income tax. One of the main critiques of it is like, if you make $100,000 a year and your family is getting the UBI, then you just add that on top of the 100,000. But actually, in reality, not everybody gets the same amount because everyone is taxed differently. And because we have a progressive income tax system, people at the higher income levels are being taxed more. Capital gains taxes more, well, at 15% in the US. But there's not an equal amount of taxation depending on how much you earn. We would be eliminating redundant systems. That's already going to save money in the system. It's much simpler for the IRS to tax this way than taxing on welfare and redistributing it that way. So the actual cost of running the program is very low. It's like similar to Social Security at around 2%. I think 1% to 2%. I can't remember the exact number.
Matteo, sorry to interrupt. I've argued about this with Scott for years, and I've never persuaded him, and he's never persuaded me. David's right. The amount of money that you need to fund a UBI system is colossal. It is in the trillions. It's a significant percentage of US GDP. And prior to full automation, it's politically utterly impossible. There's just no way that the American population is going to agree to a level of taxation that generates that much money. Post full automation, it's obviously going to be necessary, or something like it. Some redistributive system is going to be necessary. What interests me is, let's say we get to full automation, or we get to 50% unemployment. I think it'll be full, but maybe it's 50%. What does that system look like? How do governments, world authorities, tax the people who are making all of the money, which will be the providers of the large language models and maybe the agents that sit on top of them? There'll be a few thousand people in San Francisco and China. How do we ensure that those organizations give over enough money to keep all of the rest of the human population in every country, not just in America and China, not just alive, not just subsistence, but actually with a generous income? How do we make that happen? We need blueprints for an economic system that makes that possible. And so far, I'm aware of none, and I've looked. And I'm wondering whether you've got any thoughts about what that system might look like.
Universal basic capital is like creating a sovereign wealth fund. There's more to it than just giving money. If we think about it in terms of working hours rather than just jobs total, the economy is a total number of working hours and not simply a total number of jobs, because it depends on how many hours each job constitutes. I could argue about UBI for quite a long time, but I know we don't have enough time for that. But let's just say there's some nominal way in which we can give dividends to the population, say through stock sales. There's been multiple proposals recently. For instance, I just was reading one this morning about replacing the corporate tax on AI companies. In the US, it's 21%, but I mean, I think it should be higher, probably more like 35%, which is what the corporate tax rate was under Obama. But there's a lot of problems with getting the corporate tax. It's a lot simpler to get a non-voting share of the shares of OpenAI and Anthropic and some group of companies that are above a certain threshold. But that's not the only way. We could change the policy around the working hours. We would really want to do a combination of things. We want to give dividends to people. We want to use some of this sovereign wealth fund to invest in a transitional economy. And we want primarily also to create new industries that are maybe not yet automated, or to do many things that are useful to people that are presently not possible to be automated because we're not even thinking of them as jobs, but they are still useful. They still benefit people, but they're presently like not economically viable as jobs. That's where I also think that a jobs guarantee comes in. And if these things are thought of as separate, they can often work against each other. But if they're thought of as a unified policy, for instance, having a UBI, and we could even create a separate tax rate that says we're going to tax away money progressively as you rise up the income level, it gets progressively taxed away. You might say that that doesn't benefit the people who are higher income earners, but they could be laid off at any given time, and then they would absolutely benefit from this system. And you might start a business and it fails, and then you would benefit from this system. And any number of other cases. There's tons of them. People who are advocates of UBI have listed them out exhaustively. The public jobs guarantee is not just to give people any old job. We have lots of infrastructure needs all across the Western world, and especially in the US. like building out high-speed rail, building out various energy infrastructure, and at the community level.
But Matteo, if you take the idea of automation seriously, then the robots are going to do that work. Very few humans are going to be involved in that. And why should they be? It doesn't sound terribly interesting work, and machines, software bots and robots will be able to do it much cheaper, more effectively, and quicker.
Well, it just really depends on how quickly this happens. What I'm saying is like as long as there is human labor to be done, we should be minimizing the number of working hours and guaranteeing jobs in proportion to what the total number of hours of necessary work is. If, for instance, the number of working hours is reduced by half, then we should be reducing what the expected working week is. Instead of 40 hours, it can be 20 hours. It's not likely to be equal and even across all sectors. Some sectors will automate much faster than others. And how long will it take? I know there are people who say it's going to happen in 2027, 2028. It's already July of 2026, so I don't think that's going to happen. I think that it will take several decades to reach full automation. There are various reasons why it will be very difficult to automate certain sectors, even if it's technically possible. There's various social and cultural reasons why certain sectors will be very hard to automate. I'm not saying for all time. I'm not talking about in Star Trek time frames. If it's technically possible, it will eventually happen. But there's lots of credentialing reasons why it's difficult to automate various sectors like pharmacy and medicine, even airline pilots. We have autopilot, for instance, but we still have lots of pilots because of liability reasons.
On the timing thing, let me make a suggestion. I agree with you that the idea of full automation by 2027 looks ridiculous, and 2028, not much less. However, when you think about the power of exponential growth, famously, if you have 30 years of exponential growth in which the capability of computers and also the capability of AI doubles every 18 months or so, in 30 years, 30 years, what you get is a millionfold improvement. Now, the idea that Opus 4.8, a million times more powerful, wouldn't be able to do every single job that humans can do cheaper, better, and faster than us, I think is ludicrous. Clearly, it could. In fact, you don't need to go a millionfold. A few thousand will do. So actually, although looking at the future in the short term, it looks ridiculous that you could have full automation in a year or two. But could you have it in 10 years? Absolutely, you could. Because we're not actually going at that pace anymore. We're going faster than Moore's Law. It's not doubling every 18 months. It's doubling less than every year, the capability of AI. So we're probably going to get full automation well within 30 years. So we need a plan. We need a plan for what happens when we get there. Much more than we need to debate about the ideas of UBI now. We need to figure out when we get to full automation or nearly full automation, how the hell does that world operate?
If productivity was to increase thousands and millions of times, and we didn't still have a lot of policies that kept things artificially expensive, the way, for instance, zoning massively increases the cost of housing, which has a lot of sound political reasons for people in the real estate market, but not necessarily for people who are trying to buy or rent houses. We can, of course, reduce the cost of all of these things if we achieve full automation. There's the argument that we can reach zero marginal cost. And if we were able to achieve that and that it was accessible to everyone, there wasn't just a small group of people saying, we can 3D print everything at the cost of materials, which would be very low in this sense because you would also be automating mining and all these other things. The raw materials would also be automated all the way up the supply chain. There could be, of course, problems if there's still intellectual property law and they say, well, we're still going to charge a lot of money for this product based on IP law, and we're going to still hoard the wealth based on that, or we're going to hoard wealth based on other things that are not based on physical production. These are still problems that I think we have and we would need to immediately deal with. I don't know if we have time to go into IP law now, but I think it causes a lot of problems and significantly hampers innovation. The other thing is that if we achieve something where people can get houses for $10, then these are not big problems if we can redistribute large amounts of wealth through a sovereign wealth fund. And we wouldn't have these specific problems. And I'm sure we will adapt over time to figuring out ways to spend our time effectively and meaningfully. We maybe can't all figure it out now, what we would do with our time. I'm sure society would change dramatically. Retired people figure out what to do with their time, and nobles figured out what to do with their time, even though they didn't have to work. And there's lots of things that can't be automated, like your individual relationships can't be easily automated. There's all kinds of things that we wouldn't want to automate because actually the whole purpose is in the fact of doing it. We're not going to automate our leisure activities, for instance. That doesn't make any sense. There are many ways in which we would probably invent entirely new cultural forms and totally different things to do. And these questions will eventually be anachronistic at a future time. The problem is not that future world where we figured it out, but the transition between these worlds, which is why I'm concerned with the transition. I don't know how long it could take. We could debate whether it's a very hard takeoff. Suddenly there's mass automation and mass unemployment, or whether or not it takes decades. I'm apt to believe it will take decades for a variety of reasons. Like, it's very difficult to eliminate people from the medical field because of liability, because a system, for people to really trust it, it has to be so much more accurate than a person. It has to be almost foolproof. Even if you say, oh, it's better than a doctor most of the time. You see this with just Waymo. When Waymo has one accident, people lose their minds. You know how many accidents, well, I would call them collisions. Most of them are because of user error or neglect or whatever. And there are something like 125,000 fatal accidents every year and millions of non-fatal ones. But you can see this. Humans evolved for a world with other humans, and they only trust machines when they work almost perfectly. Additionally, there's an enormous capital investment that has to be made in an army of humanoid androids. It's extremely expensive to build humanoid androids if you think about it in total numbers, if we're replacing all humans. And then in the maintenance and in the development of all those things, the automation has to be 100%. Otherwise, we have to have humans in the loop somewhere. Even if it's 90%, if we massively increase the number of androids to billions, there's still then tens of millions or hundreds of millions of jobs right there. Say, for instance, that automation works excellently 95% of the time, 98%, 99%. In the case where it fails 1% of the time and that automation system can't figure out its own flaws, it creates a cascading failure across the whole system. Right now, we have very complex systems that run our world. And each one of those has thousands of experts involved in it and millions of workers who are always interacting with those experts to keep the system running. What happens when one of those systems that is at a critical point fails? In the loading and unloading of ships or trains, in the flying of cargo airplanes, the entire shipping system stops. And then there could be a cascade failure. Then people have to step in. But there's a problem if people have to step into an automated system because they don't know what's going on. So then we have to spend an enormous amount of labor, way above what we are presently spending, to try and figure out where in the chain something went wrong. We know with LLMs and with other AI systems that when one problem happens, if the solution is 99% effective, but then you have a new problem created, and then you have 1% failure, 1% failure, you also have this pile up of failures that can cause the system to collapse, and we don't know how to fix it. And so it's only when it's a 100% effective that we can just say, oh, humans don't need to be involved at all. Presently, that's just not the case. And I don't think that's going to be the case in the next decade or 2 decades. People are still going to have to fundamentally understand the system if they need to step in even 1%, even 0.1% of the time. You know what I'm saying?
I'm with you there. I do think there'll be an imperative for humans to keep track of what their systems are doing, what the androids are doing, to be able to step in, as you've suggested. But I'm not sure that's going to be a work for anything like as many people who are currently employed. That might be a much smaller proportion of people.
Yeah. Well, there is that. But there's also the fact that Is it necessarily cheaper? It has to be cheaper, significantly cheaper than employing humans. Companies are not going to invest in these technologies unless it's way cheaper. It can't just be cheaper hour for hour. It has to be cheaper in the total cost of ownership, maintenance, and upgrading. In most of the world, that's not the case. It's much cheaper to employ humans than to build an army of androids. Think of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is the world center of textile production. It's way, way cheaper to employ people in Bangladesh than to employ an army of machines. I'm not saying that that's the case for all time, but presently, I cannot imagine that we can produce an Android that would cost less than $30,000 to buy in today's dollars. And then you have to maintain that Android. And then you have to maintain the system. And if anything goes wrong anywhere along the way, it might cost you millions of dollars to fix it because you have to employ all these people, bring in outside experts, all this other stuff. And so a lot of the textile companies are going to say, we don't want to deal with all that complexity. We'll just pay people $2, $3 a day, and that's fine. We don't need to worry about that. And that's even the case with significantly higher paid workers in China. They do automate labor, of course, but they don't fully automate it in most cases. We've all seen the dark factories. They also stipulate it's dark 90% of the time. It has to be dark 100% of the time. It might not seem like a lot. Maybe to the audience, you're saying 90%, 100%, not a big deal. Well, the thing is that it is a big deal. That last 10% is the hardest part to automate. And it's the highest failure rate. And it's where the most concentrated mental labor is and where the highest costs of failure are there. And additionally, 10% doesn't sound like a lot if you're saying that if we're going to have mass unemployment, we only have 10% of the population employed. Well, no, if the cost goes down of goods, obviously demand is going to go up. So it's not going to be 10%. This could be a Jevons paradox problem where people say, okay, if I can get my house cheaper, why not just make a significantly better house? And people will substitute. Presently, most people say they're fine with Formica as their countertops. But hey, if I have all this extra money, why not have granite? Why not have something handcrafted? Then all the people with more money are going to substitute their production, or they're going to do things like spend more money on life coaches or spend money on X, Y, and Z thing. And you can say, well, maybe that could also be automated. There's a lot of maybes, and there's a lot of distance between these things. These systems work pretty well. You could say they're going to continuously work a million times better, and then a million times times a million times times a million times. It's all going to be exponential. But past results don't necessarily mean future results. And so maybe it's not necessarily going to be true in all cases. There's all kinds of other things. I've read a lot about prestige substitution. Rich people, for instance, don't spend their money on more physical goods that you can get in factories. They spend a lot more money on things that are very hard to automate. Maybe a working class person doesn't care if they go to Supercuts, and maybe if you get a $10 haircut, Supercuts is a chain of barbers. Maybe they don't care about getting their haircut by a machine. But for various reasons, a lot of very wealthy people will spend thousands of dollars on a haircut. And that seems absurd to working class people, obviously. But there's prestige in getting your hair cut by a specific person. And we know already that many wealthy people spend absurd amounts of money on just having a particular design label that may be of slightly better quality. But is this particular pair of jeans worth $10,000? People spend absurd amounts of money on designer clothes. In the future, if there's so much more money and so much more productivity, we might have a situation where massive amounts of demand shifts to status goods. And ordinary people who maybe only spend a tiny fraction of their income on status goods today are spending huge amounts of their income on status goods. And there might be other types of things. People might just find very clever ways of virtue signaling. And then there's a whole economy around virtue, around the meaning economy. I can't endlessly speculate on these things, but what I'm saying is that I think there are many ways in which the transition is going to be a lot longer than what Silicon Valley says. Even if it's technically possible, even if a system is so much better than it is today, The implementation, not only the practical technical implementation, which is always so much harder than the theoretical engineering of a system and its technical capabilities, but also the social and cultural implementation is just many orders of magnitude more complicated than what it says on the tin, that we just have a more powerful system and it's just going to work. I think there are many ways in which it won't work, and there will be tons of jobs in making these things work and in adapting the systems and doing all this other stuff. Insofar as there are any things that people can do, then we should be focusing on building our policy toward making sure that those things are meaningful and that people can do them so that they can survive and that the transition is smooth toward the next world.
What are the practical policies that you would recommend to politicians for the next 5 years? You've talked about exploring UBI or UBC, Universal Basic Capital. You've talked about more progressive taxation, more tax on capital, less tax possibly on labour to match. You've talked about prioritising shorter working hours, more time off. Is there something else that you think should be clear in the minds of politicians that we're not hearing enough of yet to help prepare for this uncertain world? But although we're uncertain about it, we can be fairly sure there's a lot of disruptive transitions involved.
Yeah, I've mentioned a bunch of things, and I think there are many more things, but I think all those things I mentioned will all be very difficult to implement. I do agree with Callum that there is enormous political headwinds to these things, but there will also be huge headwinds to social disasters. And we really don't want to live through the onset of social catastrophe. It's hard to overstate how bad it would be if there was 20, 30% unemployment, let alone 100%, without any mitigation. And so, one of the main things we should do is take it seriously. The thing about it is that even if it's only 10%, even if it's only 5%, even if it's technically possible, but implementation is so hard that it takes so much longer than we think. We don't know how close we are to the peak of the current wave of technology. We could be very far from it or very close to it. And you hear experts say contradictory things constantly, like we're almost at the peak of LLMs, we're nowhere near the peak. All those things aside, there's huge benefits to reshaping our industrial policy. We've already seen massive problems in the present economy, in the present techno oligarchy, where Elon Musk is a trillionaire and large numbers of people, especially in the UK and the US, are unable to get housing. They're waiting around the block to get an apartment because there's only one affordable apartment in every neighborhood, and people are paying £4,000 a month for one bedroom, even a studio in some neighborhoods in London. Same thing in New York City, San Francisco, Dublin. All these places, people are paying enormous amounts of money. And all that can actually be solved relatively simply. Some of these things are already on the policy platforms of existing political parties, bringing the housing crisis under control, the healthcare crisis under control. All of these things have enormous dividends on their own. The more the unemployment rate increases and the more inequality increases and the more poverty increases, the more payoff there is for solving these problems. Everybody already agrees that these are problems. We can try to bring some innovative solutions to solving things like the housing crisis. We could try to bring more solutions to the healthcare crisis, to the health span crisis that I mentioned in one of the earlier talks we did with IEET. There's already a crisis in every city, and there's lots of good data for London and New York specifically. People in some neighborhoods are living decades longer, up to 21 years longer. Actually, in this case, with health span, of course, is how many years you're healthy in your lifetime. And in London specifically, the lowest income neighborhoods, I can't remember the name of the neighborhood now, but it's like 53 or something is the health span. The median person in the lower income neighborhoods of London is getting 53 healthy years. And in the higher income neighborhoods, I think it might be in the city of London or in Soho or something, it's like 74, 75 years. And that's median, of course. That means half the population in that neighborhood is getting less than that.
It looks like Lewisham is the area with 57 years of healthy life expectancy.
57 years, yeah.
Whereas Richmond upon Thames, 70 years in good health. The longevity gap is indeed worrying, and it could lead to all kinds of bad consequences, not just for the people who are themselves deprived of health, but it disturbs the whole psychology of society. It puts all kinds of pressures on board, and it might drive some people to extreme actions.
Yeah.
Absolutely, we need solutions to these problems.
If we were spending resources into solving these kinds of problems, solving the health span gap problem, solving the housing problem, solving the longevity crisis that we're presently in. Of course, as a species, we've been in forever. As you know, abolishing aging, ending aging, first of all, has massive dividends. Doesn't just mean that you have more life to live, but there's an enormous cost on society for the aging people. And there's a huge psychological, mental, emotional, physical toll that aging puts on people, but also on all the caretakers in people's families and neighborhoods, and obviously on the healthcare system. We're spending huge amounts of resources on all of these things, and we're missing out on all of the life that could be had, on all the things that people could be doing, and on all the things that people who are spending huge amounts of their energy and time presently in care of elderly people could be doing. Some of those things put people directly into poverty. Considering that people are least healthy in the lowest income neighborhoods, that means that more family members have a higher burden in lower income neighborhoods that they could be spending on getting out of poverty or educating themselves or doing other things that they're not doing because they have to take care of their family members because they don't have money to pay for private care. The system doesn't provide the care that they need. So they have to work less hours. They have to forego going to school. They have to maybe even forego having kids. All of these problems compound on each other. We could be spending energy on solving these problems. Those sorts of things have huge dividends that also can be part of something like I'm saying with a public jobs guarantee. It's not presently the priority of the private sector to solve the health span crisis, but we could be employing lots of people trying to figure out solutions to these problems, working with people to try and figure out what would work best. How do we redesign neighborhoods? How do we redesign care systems? How do we redesign research? There's just an endless number of things that are presently not really part of the employment equation, or they're a very small part. They're in the nonprofit sector, or universities might be spending a small amount of money, but it's just a tiny amount compared to what we could be spending on it. And I say spending primarily in terms of resources and hours of labor. Again, why is it not possible to automate it right now? Is because we can only automate the things that we have the collective knowledge to solve. We can't just automate anything unless we have systems that are so advanced that they can try and figure out anything a human could possibly do, which is not how LLMs currently work. They work based on what we're feeding into them. They're not magical. It's very important to note the reason why an LLM can write emails is because they've read trillions of emails. Why can they write a news article? They've read every news article. It's not magic. They have data. But if the data is very sparse because these things have not been done enough, then they don't have the data. They don't have the knowledge. Maybe in the future, these things could be automated. And of course, our goal is to end aging. But in the intermediate term, more money spent into the care system, figuring out how to optimize the care system so that everyone can live their best life based on what our present level of development is, figuring out how to move to the next stage of development. These are all problems that shorter hours, universal basic capital, public jobs guarantee could be directed toward. We don't have to just say it can go toward anything. We could direct our spending and resources towards something.
Yep. The transition will go smoother if there aren't terrible social problems festering, like the housing crisis and the healthcare crisis.
Definitely.
So those of us who care about surviving the transition, we've got to work hard on solving these problems. But it's not just traditional progressive politics. There's technoprogressive, which means that sometimes the solution involves technological innovation as well as institutional innovation.
Yes.
I'm sure you'll have lots more to say when you come to the conference in London in September.
Definitely.
Thanks very much, Matteo, for giving so much of your time and thoughtfulness, and in some ways a different take on the future from which many of our previous guests have offered. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on.